Ladies and gentlemen, it appears that we only have 5 champions left to cover when it comes to the Glorious Guardians champions, and in today's one, we're gonna be covering a much more controversial one in my opinion. His buff definitely did improve him, gave him a lot more utility as well as a lot more damage, but unfortunately when it comes to the damage part, you kinda have to take about 4 to 5 minutes to pretty much get it up. You can call him a Science Aegon, a Science Strife even, which is a bit disappointing but kinda does make sense. They've given us champions that are great in battlegrounds, which is short length fights. They've given us some that pretty much need to ramp up a little bit in order to get their full potential. And then with Sentry, he's pretty much just made for long form content. Whether that's a good thing or not, we'll be discussing that a little bit later. Cause before we get too much into that, we need to discuss all of his abilities first, explain how he's actually played, and then later on discuss why nobody plays him.
Marcelo, eso, ya dijimos que eso es racista.
No.
Ni hao.
Soy mexicana.
Sentry is immune to all Nullify, Fate Steal, and Incinerate effects, and any critical damage rating that he has is actually converted into attack rating, increasing his attack by a certain amount. As for his bulwark buffs, which the max of these that he can have is 20, whenever he inflicts a debuff, he gains 1 bulwark buff for 25 seconds, which increases his block proficiency by a certain amount, and if he would gain a precision buff using the Dexterity Mastery, he instead gains a bulwark buff. He can only gain these via dexing every 0.5 seconds, and while a personal bulwark buff is active, the combat power rate for Mystic champions cannot exceed the amount that they started the fight with. At the end of his special attacks, he converts each active buff into a 15-second passive of the corresponding type. If it's his bulwark buffs, he converts them into passives, maxing out at 20. If it's a Fury buff, it turns into a Fury passive, increasing his attack rating by a certain amount, maxing out at 40 stacks. And if it's a regen buff, it converts into a regen passive, healing a certain amount of health, which maxes out at 20. Any effects that are not listed will then be converted into Fury passives. But moving on to his solar forms. Whenever he converts 1 buff into a passive, he gains 1 solar energy, and when he reaches 20 or more solar energy, he consumes all of them and changes forms from his base form into an absolute strength form and then into a brilliant might form. He switches to these in the exact same order, and while he's not in a solar form, his basic attacks will inflict a exhaustion debuff lasting for 20 seconds, maxing out at 10 stacks, and reduces the opponent's critical damage. When he's in his absolute strength form, his medium and his light attacks will inflict a 10% wither debuff for 20 seconds, maxing out at 10 stacks. As for his brilliant might form, his heavy attack will inflict 2 energy vulnerability debuffs for 20 seconds, maxing out at 10 stacks. All of his attacks that inflict debuffs while not in his base form will additionally deal 50% of the damage dealt as energy damage instead, and they gain an additional amount of attack rating for each debuff on the opponent, up to 99 debuffs. Whenever he reaches 20 solar energy while he's in his brilliant might form, he then removes any solar forms and gains a reality warp. These are his persistent charges, maxing out at 10 stacks. He gains 1 whenever he wins a fight and loses 1 whenever he's defeated, and each reality warp increases the amount of attack rating that he can gain via his empowered attacks per debuff by 50%, and while he's at 3 or more reality warps, his heavy attacks refresh all of his personal debuffs. While he's at 6 or more reality warps, charging a heavy attack after landing a first medium attack will inflict a stun passive for 0.75 seconds, and while he's at 8 or more reality warps, he then starts each fight in absolute strength. But as for his special attacks, the special one. On activation, it inflicts a non-stacking halt debuff for 20 seconds, which causes unstoppable opponents to behave as if they weren't unstoppable at all. The Special 2. On activation, he gains one of his personal fury passives for each debuff on the opponent, up to 10, and that's pretty much it. And last but not least, the Special 3. Instead of gaining solar energy, he gains a regeneration buff for each buff converted into a passive by this attack. These regeneration buffs heal him for a certain amount of health over 15 seconds, and the max stacks of these regens that he can have is 20. As for his awakened ability, whenever he's struck by a basic attack, he gains an indestructible passive for 2 seconds, which goes on cooldown for a certain amount of time, and whenever he enters a solar form while he has more than 20 solar energy, he then pauses all of his personal debuffs on the opponent for a certain amount of time for each solar energy over 20. Moving on to the section of how to actually play him, since his kit can get a little bit confusing, though it's very simple once we actually explain it. Sentry basically has 3 forms, which is his base form, his absolute strength form, which is the yellow one, and his brilliant might form, which is the red one. His basic attacks in the first 2 forms inflict debuffs on the opponent. Whenever you inflict a debuff onto the opponent, you basically gain a bulwark buff as well. And once you have 20 of these buffs in the base form, you throw a special attack to convert your 20 bulwark buffs into bulwark passives. And if you convert 20 of them, you'll then be pushed into his second form, which is the yellow one. Now in the yellow one, you pretty much just do the same thing. Apply 20 debuffs with his basic attacks, and once you have 20 of his bulwark buffs, you launch a special attack, either 1 or 2, to convert the buffs into passives, and then you go into his final form. In his red one, he can only apply debuffs on his heavy attacks, so you pretty much want to spam those. And then once you've applied 20 debuffs and you have 20 of your bulwark buffs, you then throw a special attack and you start the whole cycle over. Each time you perform this cycle, you gain 1 reality warp, which increases your damage by a lot, and also gives you some extra effects like mentioned in the previous section. But that's pretty much how to play him. Very simple, not too complex, and hopefully this section does help, and I might have this section for future videos as well, depending on whether this was actually good or not. But anyways, on to this man's attire, and it's kind of basic, to be honest. These glorious Guardians champions have to have the worst drip imaginable, except maybe for Purgatory or something. Cause what is this, man? Sentry's one is a bit better, I would say, since it's very basic, plain, straight to the point, and doesn't really do anything extra. It's pretty much just Kurt Cobain in a Superman outfit or something. A simple color combination being dark blue as well as yellow. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Definitely a 5 or 6 out of 10 outfit in my opinion, which is not a bad thing at all. But when we have drip in the game like boxes, it's kinda funny. But anyways, on to the topic of why nobody plays him. And even though this man recently just got buffed and we're only now getting him as a 7-star, I can clearly see that this man won't be seeing any play at all, and the hype will pretty much just exist now until the next batch of 7-stars are released. And this isn't because he's a bad champion or anything like that. He's actually very far from it when you consider how good he is for long form content. But the problem is mainly just ramp up champions as a whole, where they're basically just limited to one thing. And for him, I kinda have to talk about in 2 sections, one being short to medium length fights, and the other being long form content, maybe like Necropolis or something like that. And my views on him are pretty much like this. When it comes to shorter fights, he's not bad at all, and when you actually compare his performance to long form content champions, it's actually faster than most of them. When you compare him to champions like Strife, Aegon, Wong even, this man can definitely do really well. As a 7-star at rank 1, he can take Winter Soldier in about 50 to a minute or so. And huge shout out to Marvel King Saitama. His video really changed my perspective, and I'm pretty much re-recording this again, kinda cause I changed my thoughts after seeing how good he is. When it comes to short form content, you can pretty much consider him as Misty Knight, where the damage, yeah, it's pretty good, but you never really see Misty Knight being used anywhere. Except for that one dude on the internet, but other than him, there's always going to be a champion that does damage way faster and pretty much takes those shorter fights much better. When it comes to long form content, however, this dude, oh my goodness. After seeing some rank 3 gameplay from Nagase, I can definitely say that they cooked with his buff indeed. It's absolutely insane, and the only sort of downside to this is that you kinda have to ramp him up, which takes about 5 to 10 minutes, but when you compare it to other ramp up champions, his ramp up is actually a lot shorter and less tedious to do in my opinion. As for whether you should rank him up, take him to rank 2 or 3, or max him out as a 6 star, my opinion is simply this and this alone. Do you think you're gonna be using this man 1 or 2 months later, after the whole hype of him dies down, after these glorious Guardians champions aren't on the spotlight anymore? And this happens quite a lot. I mean, look at the other 7 stars that we've gotten. Or will you forget about him and pretty much never use him again until a niche scenario pops up? Because when it comes to long form content champions, yeah, you should rank them up, they definitely make that type of content easier. But at the end of the day, once that content isn't in the game anymore, what are you really gonna be doing with him? Now to be fair, Sentry is really good even outside of long form content. Like I said, he can take Winter Soldier in about 50 to 60 seconds or so, but that kind of damage, like I said, you'd 100% of the time use a champion that is either faster or does the job much more efficiently. His utility is a little bit limited. He's immune to Incinerate, Nullify, as well as Fate Steal, and he inflicts a Halt debuff which counters Unstoppable, and his Wither debuffs which sort of reduce power gain. But other than those, there are champions that do all of these things a lot better, and so the main focus is pretty much just long form content. And like I said, when it comes to long form content, it's not oftentimes that you actually be using him. It's a very controversial topic indeed, and I don't want to tell you to rank him up just because his numbers are insane after 10 minutes of ramping up. But let me know down in the comments what you guys think of him. Make sure to join my Discord group, the link will be down in the description. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace!